Let's talk about wide receivers that you need to be starting in week 8 of fantasy football. As always, we're going to break this up into 3 different categories: your smash starts, your solid starts, and your high risk, high reward starts. 9 total players, 3 categories. The names on the list right now are all obvious must starts. And let's start with the high risk, high reward category. First guy up is Troy Franklin, the wide receiver for the Broncos, who could very well have a monster game in week 8 when fantasy managers need him the most. And while he has been kind of hard to trust so far in fantasy, he's been very inconsistent. We know he had that monster performance in week 2 where he racked up 24 fantasy points, and it was looking like he was on his way to a breakout campaign, but he hasn't really done much since that game. Week 7 was an interesting one for the second-year receiver. 3 receptions, 19 yards, got into the end zone on 10 targets, which was a season high, 12.9 fantasy points. That touchdown was kind of fluky as it came on a tipped pass. And while he did make a nice catch in the end zone, you would like to see him score a touchdown where Bo Nix just throws him the football. But the 10 targets are still nice to see. And Franklin is on the field a ton for the Broncos. He's running the second most routes behind only Courtland Sutton, 73% route participation last week. Bo Nix hasn't been great overall. I do think he starts to turn it around. We saw last week, 4 total touchdowns. He ended up winning that game for the Broncos. We know Nix, Franklin are former college teammates. Maybe they start to really develop the chemistry at the NFL level because we really haven't seen a ton from them. But I do think bigger, better days are coming. And if you're looking for a high upside receiver this week, then look no further than Mr. Franklin, because I think, like I said earlier, he could go absolutely crazy in this game against the Dallas Cowboys, who we know don't have a good defense. They can't stop anyone through the air, as they are allowing the most PPR points per target to perimeter receivers. And this is also a situation where the Dallas Cowboys offense is red hot right now. They just got back CeeDee Lamb. They're going to put up a lot of points. I know the Denver Broncos do have a good defense, but Jackson Dart, Cam Skattebo are running up and down the football field, racking up points on this defense. So what do you think the Dallas Cowboys are going to do? So I'm assuming that the Broncos are going to be chasing points in this one, trying to keep up, which means they're going to be throwing a lot. If there were ever a blow-up spot for Franklin this year, it would be in week 8. All right, moving on to our next guy, Tez Johnson, the rookie receiver for the Tampa Bay Bucks, who we saw stepped up in a big way on Monday Night Football in a game where they had no one on offense. And then the guy that they got back, Mike Evans, that they've been waiting for him to return, left the game due to a broken collarbone. Hate to see it, as Evans will now be out for a while again. But Johnson did step up in a big way. He reeled in 4 receptions for 58 yards. He had that impressive touchdown where he hurdled a dude. Nice spin move at the end to get into the end zone on 9 targets. You like to see that. 15.8 fantasy points, 74% route participation, has now scored a touchdown in back-to-back games, and is going to be a big part of this Tampa Bay offense going forward, because who do they have? No Mike Evans, no Bucky Irving, no Chris Godwin. It's going to be the Mecca Ibuka show, and Tez Johnson probably mixed in with Cade Otton. And we know Mayfield is still looking like one of the best quarterbacks in football this year, and he's averaging 35+ passing attempts per game. So why would you not want a receiver who's probably going to see a lot of work attached to a really good quarterback on an offense that's going to throw the ball a ton? I think this is probably going to be a bounce back performance for Baker, who kind of struggled in week 7 against the Lions. And this week they get a very beatable Saints secondary that's pretty average against fantasy receivers, as they've allowed 7 receivers to score at least 12.2 PPR points. I think Johnson is a big play waiting to happen. He's a nice high upside guy. Again, there is risk, right? That's why he's in this category, but I do think he has a really good shot to score a touchdown again in week 8. You could do a lot worse than starting Tez in your flex. All right, moving on to our next guy, Xavier Legette. Who would have thought? It was looking like Legette was going to get phased out of this Carolina Panthers passing attack, but he said not so fast, as he kind of came out of nowhere in week 7, but had a huge fantasy day, 9 receptions, 92 yards, got into the end zone on 11 targets, 24.2 fantasy points. He now has a touchdown in 2 out of his last 3 games. It's by far the best game of his season, maybe the best game of his young career. And I do think Xavier is a nice, maybe some may say sneaky play this week, because Bryce Young dealing with an ankle sprain, probably not going to play. So you get Andy Dalton under center, and he showed nice chemistry with Lee Gett in week 7 when he came in because Bryce Young got hurt. So if they kind of continue that rapport this week, it could be another big game. And let's not forget, Xavier is a former first-round receiver last year who might just be starting to finally catch his stride. We know this Carolina receiver room all of a sudden feels a little crowded with Tetairoa McMillan. Jalen Coker is working his way back into the mix, and now Lee Gett. But one thing we know for certain is the matchup this week against the Buffalo Bills is going to be a tough one because Buffalo lost on Sunday Night Football against the New England Patriots, and then they had a bye week, so they've been rested, they've been angry, they've been probably waiting to get back on the football field, and they're going to go off. Josh Allen and company is going to put up a ton of points, which means Carolina is going to have to throw the football a lot if they want to have even the slightest chance of winning this football game, which means you want all the pass catchers in this matchup. And Xavier has really nice flex appeal this week because of Andy Dalton, because of the nature of the game. I would be riding the hot hand and plugging him back into your lineup. All right, moving on to the next category, solid starts. First guy up is Jordan Addison, who has been playing really good football since returning from his 3-game suspension, as he's averaging 17.4 fantasy points per game and has topped 110 yards receiving in 2 out of 3 games this year. And he's coming off a monster performance in week 7, 9 receptions, 128 yards on 12 targets, 21.8 fantasy points. It appears that Jordan is a huge part of this Minnesota passing attack through the first 3 games that he's played this season. 22% target share, 36% air yard share, leads the Vikings in red zone targets, and has built a really nice connection with Carson Wentz, who is set to start again in week 8. No JJ McCarthy in this one. And let's be honest, Addison is just a really good receiver who would probably be the wide receiver 1 on a lot of NFL teams. But Addison obviously doesn't get as much attention in Minnesota because of a guy named Justin Jefferson. But maybe Jordan is benefiting from being the number 2 option on this offense, as he's not getting as much defensive attention, and he's shown improvements this season already in target per route run, first down per route run, and yards per route run. So this is a young player that's only getting better, and I think he puts together another strong performance on Thursday Night Football. And while the matchup against LA isn't super favorable, as they do have a good defense, they have a nice secondary, but last week against the Colts, Daniel Jones and company marched up and down the football field, which makes me think that this game tonight could be high scoring between the Vikings, Chargers, 2 good offenses going at it. I want as many pieces of this game as possible. I think Addison does have another strong performance in this one and needs to be started on your roster. All right, moving on to our next guy, DK Metcalf, who's coming off a very disappointing week 7 performance because he was going up against the Cincinnati Bengals. It wasn't a tough matchup. We all thought he was going to go crazy, and he did let you down, but that game was also very entertaining as it turned into a shootout between 2 40-year-old quarterbacks in Aaron Rodgers and Joe Flacco. Some were calling it the Unk Bowl, which I find accurate and hilarious at the same time, but don't get it twisted. Both of those quarterbacks were balling in this one, and even though the Steelers did end up putting up 31 points, DK only finished with 3 catches for 50 yards on 5 targets, 8 fantasy points. You would think in a game where they threw a ton that Metcalf would have had a bigger impact, but it was kind of the tight end show for Pittsburgh, which that's not going to continue. Metcalf is obviously the alpha in this wide receiver room, and that performance did snap his touchdown streak, though, of 4 straight games. You don't love to see that. But still, overall, Metcalf has been the guy for the Steelers through the air. 42% of the team's air yards, 21% target share, 23% target per route run rate, and is being used a ton downfield, which we love to see in an Arthur Smith offense where you really don't know how they're going to use talented receivers anymore because he has burned us in the past. But they are using DK correctly this year as he ranks 5th in the NFL in yards per reception. I do think DK will continue to be a big play threat for the Steelers, and they're going to need a lot of him on Sunday Night Football against the Green Bay Packers. It's a revenge game, as we know, for Aaron Rodgers. And the Packers have allowed the 7th most fantasy points per game to perimeter receivers. And I would not be shocked overall if DK has one of his best games as a Steeler on Sunday Night Football in week 8, where Aaron Rodgers is probably going to want to sling it, throw the football all over his former team, do whatever it takes to win the game. So don't lose faith in DK coming off a bad performance against the Bengals. I think he bounces back in a big way against Green Bay. All right, moving on to our next guy, Stefon Diggs, who has been absolutely incredible considering he's 31, coming off a major knee injury, tearing his ACL. But since week 4, Stefon is the wide receiver 11 in total fantasy points, averaging 15.1 fantasy points per game, along with a 30% target share, which is 5th in the NFL, 31% of the team's air yards, 33% first read share, and on the year he ranks 4th in targets per route run behind only Puka Nacua, JSN, and Rashee Rice. He's 3rd in yards per route run. Like, what more can you say? Diggs is balling right now, and he's far and away Drake May's favorite target, who's playing like an MVP at this point. And Diggs has been the main beneficiary of May playing out of his mind, as he's seen the highest catchable target rate through 7 weeks among all receivers at 91%. Like, how lucky is Stefon Diggs to go from Josh Allen to a mini Josh Allen in Drake May? Like, it's been really fun to watch. It's been a match made in heaven for the duo, and I think Diggs does stay hot in week 8 against the Cleveland Browns, who are allowing 29.9 PPR fantasy points per game to receivers this season. I think you can mark it down. Diggs is going to score his first touchdown as a Patriot on Sunday. All right, moving on to our next category, smash starts. First guy up on the list is Ladd McConkey, who started off the year very slow. We were starting to think that he was going to be one of the bigger busts in fantasy, but he's turned it around in a massive way as of late. Over his last 3 games, he's averaging 17.9 fantasy points per game, 10 targets per game, and has scored double-digit fantasy points in every game over that span. And in week 7, he went crazy. 9 receptions, 67 yards, 15 targets, 15.7 fantasy points. I wouldn't say he went crazy, but that target volume and those receptions are really nice to see. He was the wide receiver 3, though, in week 7 in expected fantasy points at 25.6. Ladd also leads the NFL in end zone targets over the last 3 weeks. He's been cooking. Bigger games are coming from McConkey. The target share, the underlying metrics are telling us that the uber talented second-year receiver is going to have some monster games upcoming. And I think we potentially see one tonight in a potential shootout against the Vikings, who just got shredded by a struggling passing attack in the Eagles last week. A.J. Brown had a big game. Devontae Smith had a huge game. Like, the Vikings defense is such a streaky defense. You never really know what you're going to get. But I do think Ladd erupts in this one and puts together a huge fantasy performance tonight on Thursday Night Football. Moving on to our next guy, Chris Olave, another guy who kind of started a little slow, but is starting to catch fire as of late. He's coming off his best game of the season in week 7, 5 receptions, 98 yards, 2 touchdowns on 7 targets, 26.8 fantasy points. We knew it was only a matter of time before Olave had a big game. Similar to Ladd, his usage, his underlying metrics were all screaming that a big performance was on the horizon, and we finally saw it. And at this point, Olave is the Saints offense. Alvin Kamara is not looking like Alvin Kamara anymore. They just don't really have anyone else. So the passing game runs through Chris, as he has a ridiculous 28.5% target share. And even though the Saints aren't any good, right? They stink. They have no weapons on offense, like we just mentioned. It helps that they have a really good coach, a really creative play caller in Kellen Moore, because he knows how to utilize his number 1 receiver. He moves them around all over the field, and I have a lot of optimism for Olave, not only this week, but for the rest of the season, because his yards per target have jumped from 5.5 over the first 5 weeks to 9.8 and 14 over the last 2 games, which means the Saints are finally using him downfield, so he's not going to have 9 catches for 40 yards, which it felt like he was doing that every week to start the year, right? They're using him more downfield, which means his ceiling, his upside is tremendous. I think Olave is going to benefit from the Saints also being not a good team on defense, so they can't stop opposing offenses, which means the Saints are going to continue to have to throw the football at a very high rate, and I think that continues in Week 8 against the Tampa Bay Bucks, who have been very average against receivers this season, as they've allowed the opposing number one receiver to score at least 19.2 PPR points in each of the past 3 games. You obviously love to see that. I would be starting Olave this week with a ton of confidence. I think he has top 10, top 12 upside at the position. And moving on to our last guy, Rome Odunze. It's been really rough for Rome as of late because he started the year looking like he was going to be one of the biggest breakouts, one of the biggest steals in all fantasy drafts, but he's cooled off tremendously. Over his last 2 games, he scored 5 fantasy points in each of his last 2 games. And a lot of that can be blamed on Caleb Williams, who's been struggling to throw the football as of late, as Rome has one of the lowest catchable target rates among receivers through the first 7 weeks. Not great. Another problem for Odunze as of late is that Chicago has been running the football a ton, and they've been very effective with that. But nonetheless, I do think Odunze turns it around. He still leads the Chicago wide receiver room in target share, air yard share, and routes run. And don't forget, he was the wide receiver 3 in fantasy through the first 4 weeks. That was far from a fluke. I do think better days are ahead for Rome. Even though Caleb has been struggling throwing the football, he still has a very strong connection with Odunze. This is still an offense led by Ben Johnson that wants to get this passing attack figured out. I do think they figure it out, and it could happen as early as week 8 in a potential shootout with the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, that's if Lamar Jackson returns, but I think this is a perfect bounce back opportunity, not only for Rome, but for this entire Bears passing attack, as the Ravens have not been good as of late, as they've allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to receivers this season. This is not the week to bench Odunze. I do think he has top 5 upside at the position in week 8. That's all I have for you guys today. I really appreciate each and every one of you. You guys are all literally the best. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, comment down below, and I'll see you in the next one.